The land had a way of scouring you clean, leaving nothing
We
but
have to
bone
go
and a
now.
bitter
They are
kind
coming.
of grit. That's what I believed anyway, after the fever took my husband and left me alone in that little timber claim shack on the edge of nowhere. The silence there wasn't peaceful. It was a loud, judging thing, filled with the echoes of a life that was supposed to be, and now wasn't. I'd hear the wind through the canyon and think it was his voice. I'd see a shadow move at the edge of the pine scrub, and my foolish heart would leap for a second, thinking he'd come back from checking the trapline, but he never did. All that came were the stories from the few scattered homesteaders when I made my grim trips for supplies. They talked in low, uneasy tones around the stove at the trading post, their eyes darting toward the wild, broken hills that rose like a rusty fortress behind my land. That's where the trouble was, they said. That's where he was? They said Apache was a ghost in the hills, a shadow that bled into the rock, a story told to scare children and keep men with rifles close to their hearths at night. He was a remnant, they whispered, of the old wars, a warrior who refused the reservation and the dying of the light. They claimed he could melt into stone, that he'd vanished from a cavalry patrol right before their eyes in a cloud of dust and wrath. Some said he was a spirit, punishing anyone who dared dig into his mountains. Others just called him a dangerous animal, the last of a wild breed that needed putting down. For me, a young widow with nothing but a hollow chest and a claim she couldn't work, he was just another part of the landscape's cruelty, a myth that made the lonely nights longer and the empty days more fearful. I tried not to think about ghosts. I had enough of my own. It was the Bay Mare that started it all. She was my last thread to the world, my only way to get to the post. When she broke loose one evening and vanished into those twilight hills, it felt like the final, mean joke. I couldn't lose her. So, with a trembling hand, I took my husband's old rifle from its pegs, a weight I'd never wanted to carry, and I went after her. I told myself I'd just go to the foothills, call her name, look for tracks. But a snapped branch here, a hoofprint in a patch of soft earth there, and I was pulled deeper, further into the belly of those silent, watchful rocks than I had ever been. The pines closed in, their scent thick and somber. The canyon walls narrowed, painted in the long, late-afternoon shadows that seemed to move on their own. The stories whispered at the back of my mind, but the need was stronger than the fear. I had to find that horse. I found the canyon instead. A narrow, hidden slash in the earth I never knew existed, hidden behind a curtain of ancient, weeping willow. The air changed the moment I pushed through. Cooler, damper, smelling of damp stone and something else, a faint, smoky scent that was not of campfire. My heart began a hard, steady drum against my ribs. This was a place that didn't want visitors. The tracks I'd been following were gone, swallowed by a creek that chuckled over smooth stones. I was about to turn back, the fear finally winning, when I saw it, a darker patch in the canyon wall, partly screened by a fallen pine. A cave. Something made me go to it. Not courage, but a desperate, stubborn anger. Anger at the land, at the fever, at the loneliness. If this place held my horse, or the ghost that stole her, I would face it. I crouched at the entrance, the rifle slick in my sweaty palms. Inside was blackness, absolute. But the smell was stronger, hear that smoke, and beneath it, the coppery, unsettling tongue of blood. I called out, my voice a weak, swallowed thing in that vast stone throat. Only my own echo answered. I took one step in, then another, the light from the world behind me fading to a distant gray coin. That's when the world stopped. One moment I was standing in the damp, dark, squinting. The next, I was not alone. There was no sound, no warning. Just a rush of movement, a shape detaching itself from the very wall. A hand, hard as iron and startlingly warm, clamped over my mouth, stifling my scream. An arm like a seasoned oak limb locked around my waist, pulling me back against the solid, unyielding wall of a chest. I dropped the rifle. It clattered on the stone, a useless final sound. I kicked, I thrashed, but it was like fighting the mountain itself. He was immense, a living force of heat and muscle and restrained power. This was no ghost. This was a man. My breath came in ragged, terrified gasps against his palm. I could feel the rapid, heavy beat of his heart against my back, a frantic rhythm that matched my own. He was trembling, a fine, constant shake that spoke of exhaustion, of pain, of a terrible strain held too long. The smell of blood was on him, a fresh, dark scent. We stood locked like that in the utter dark, two creatures caught in a trap of their own making. I was frozen, waiting for the knife, for the end I'd been expecting since the day they buried my husband. But the end didn't come. Instead, his head bowed, his face pressing into the tangled mess of my hair at my shoulder. A sound escaped him, not a growl, not a word, but a raw, shattered exhale that seemed to come from the deepest, weariest part of him. The arm around my waist tightened, not in threat, but in something that felt like a desperate, final clutch at the world of the living. The warmth of him seeped through my dress, a shocking human heat in the cave's chill. The stories crumbled to dust in my mind. This was not a spirit of vengeance. This was a man, hurt and desperate, holding on to me as if I were the only solid thing in a spinning world. Slowly, ever so slowly, the iron grip of his hand over my mouth loosened. It didn't move away, but the pressure eased, a silent question. I didn't scream, I don't know why. Maybe because a scream would have been swallowed by the stone. Maybe because in that incredible, suspended moment I understood a fraction of his desperation. We were both survivors in a country that had shown neither of us any kindness. I gave the smallest nod I could manage, a movement he must have felt rather than seen. His hand fell away from my mouth, coming to rest, still trembling on my shoulder. We didn't move, my own breaths were loud in the silence. I could feel the rough linen of his clothing, the hard planes of his body, the sticky, warm wetness of blood soaking through the fabric at his side. The tension shifted, coiling into something new, something even more dangerous. It was no longer just the tension of captor and captive. It was the tension of two strangers, enemies by every law of this hard land, locked in an impossible intimacy. He needed something, shelter, aid, silence, and I, a widow with nothing left to lose, held the power to give or deny it all. Outside, far away, a jay cried. A sliver of late sun found its way through the cave entrance, cutting a thin, golden line across the dusty floor, illuminating the discarded rifle. It lay between me and the light, between me and the world I knew. To reach it, I would have to pull away from him, break this terrible, silent pact we had just made in the dark. And I did not know if I would. That was the truth of it, cold and simple. His breath was warm on my neck. The desperate weight of him leaned into me, a man holding on to the edge of a cliff. The ghost was flesh and blood, and he was dying in my arms. The next move was mine. The canyon outside held its breath, and in the deep, waiting dark of the cave, so did I. The silence in the cave wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of our breathing, his ragged and pained, mine shallow and scared. That thin line of sunlight on the floor felt like a border, a frontier between the life I'd known and whatever was happening here in the dark. I could still run. My legs told me to, screaming with the instinct to bolt for that golden line, for the rifle, for the open air. But something else, a deeper, quieter voice, held me still. It was the tremor in his hands, the way his weight pressed into me not with menace, but with a profound exhaustion. A ghost wouldn't bleed. A ghost wouldn't shiver. A ghost wouldn't need to hold on to a lonely widow to keep from falling. "You're hurt," I said. The words were barely a whisper, but in that stone chamber they were as loud as a shout. He didn't answer, but his head moved slightly against my shoulder, a slow, heavy acknowledgement. The hand on my shoulder tightened for a second, then the strength seemed to go out of him all at once. He slid down the wall, pulling me with him so that we landed in an awkward heap on the cold, sandy floor. I scrambled back, finally free, my heart hammering against my throat. I stared into the shadows where he sat slumped, a darker mound against the dark. My eyes were adjusting now. I could make out the shape of him, the broad shoulders, the long hair loose around his face. He was watching me, I could feel it, even if I couldn't see his eyes. The rifle was 3 steps away. I looked at it, then back at him. He made no move to stop me. He just sat there, one hand pressed hard against his side. The coppery smell was stronger now. "My mare," I said, my voice finding a little more strength. "A bay, did you see her?" A low, rough sound came from him. It took me a moment to realize it was a word, ground out as if from a rusty throat. No. That single word changed everything. It was human. It was tired. It held no threat. He hadn't stolen my last piece of property. He was just a man hiding. The stories from the trading post rushed back, but they were different now. They weren't tales about a phantom. They were about a hunt. The pieces clicked into place with a cold, sickening clarity. The nervous men, the extra patrols we'd heard about but never seen, they weren't just scared of a story. They were hunting a man. And by the looks of him, they'd found him. I didn't think. I just moved. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady, and I walked past the rifle. I went to the cave entrance and peered out into the canyon. It was empty, painted in the long, late afternoon shadows. Quiet, but the quiet felt watchful. I picked up a few dry branches that had fallen near the entrance, then I turned and went back inside. Deeper in, I found a small, soot-blackened circle of stones from an old fire, cold and dead. I knelt there, my back to him, and laid the kindling. My hands shook as I struck a match from the tin I kept in my apron pocket. The small flame leaped to life, fragile and brave in the vast dark. I didn't look at him until the little fire was steady, feeding on the dry wood. Then I turned. The flickering light painted him in moving amber and black. He was exactly as the stories said, and yet nothing like them. He wore the clothes of his people, buckskin leggings, and a shirt, but they were worn and stained. His face was all angles and planes, lean and hardened by sun and wind. He was older than I'd imagined from the whispers, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. And his eyes, they held the firelight and threw it back, dark and watchful and full of a pain that wasn't just from the wound in his side. He studied me with the same intensity I studied him, and for a long minute we just looked, two wild creatures across a tiny fire. The blood was obvious now, a slick, dark patch soaking through his shirt just above his hip. He kept his hand pressed there, but it wasn't enough. "You need to tend to that," I said. He gave a short, sharp shake of his head. "No time." "They're close." His voice was low, graveled with disuse and pain, but his words were clear. The fear I'd felt for myself twisted into a different kind of dread. If they were close, and they found me here with him, there would be no explaining. A widow alone, aiding the very terror of the territory? I'd be ruined, if not worse. They might even think I'd given him reason to be here. The thought made my face go hot. "Why?" I asked, the question torn from me. "Why are they hunting you so hard? The man at the post said you were just a story to scare us." A faint, grim shadow of a smile touched his mouth and was gone. "Stories are easier than truth." He shifted, and a hiss of pain escaped his clenched teeth. The movement made him sway, and for a terrible second I thought he would topple into the fire. Without thinking, I was beside him, my hand on his arm to steady him. The muscle under my fingers was like corded rock. He flinched at my touch, but he didn't pull away. Up close, I could see the sheen of sweat on his skin, the pallor beneath the bronze. "Let me see it," I said, the tone I'd used when my husband took sick creeping back into my voice. It was a tone that brooked no argument. This time he didn't refuse. He leaned back against the wall, his eyes closing for a moment. Slowly he lifted his hand away from the wound. The fabric was stuck fast with dried blood. I fetched the canteen from my own belt, the one I'd brought for the search. I had a cleanish handkerchief tucked away too. I poured a little water on the cloth and, with a touch as light as I could manage, began to soften the crusted blood. He didn't make a sound, but the muscles in his jaw stood out like knotted rope. As the fabric loosened, I could see the wound. It was an ugly, angry gash, not a clean bullet hole. A knife, maybe, or a clash with sharp rock. It was deep, and it was bad. It needed stitching and poultice and rest, none of which were here in this cold cave. "This needs proper tending," I whispered, feeling utterly helpless. "It needs time," he corrected, his eyes open again, fixed on the cave ceiling. "Time I do not have. When the sun is gone, I go." "You'll bleed out before you reach the canyon mouth?" I said, a sudden, sharp anger rising in me. It was the same anger I'd felt at the land, at the sickness, at the sheer, stupid waste of it all. He looked at me then, and his gaze was so direct, so utterly weary, that my anger dissolved. "It is a better way than the one they bring," he said it simply, a statement of fact. He would choose to die free on the rocks rather than be dragged back in chains to a prison or a noose. I understood that choice. In my own way, in my lonely shack, I had been making a quieter version of it every day. The fire crackled, the only sound. I finished cleaning the wound as best I could, tearing a strip from the hem of my underskirt to make a bandage. He let me, his watchful eyes on my face the whole time. When I was done, he nodded once, a gesture of thanks that needed no words. "The Bay Marais," he said suddenly, his voice a low rumble. "She went to water at the creek west of here. Her tracks turned back toward your place. She is probably in your corral by now, wondering where her grain is." A surprised, watery sound escaped me, almost a laugh. He knew where I lived. He'd been watching. The idea should have terrified me anew, but somehow, in this strange, suspended reality, it didn't. He was a part of these hills. Of course he knew. "Thank you," I said. He looked into the fire, his face unreadable. "You should not be here. You should take your rifle and go, now, before the light fades." He was right. Every sensible bone in my body agreed. I had my horse back, or so he said. I had done more for this stranger than anyone could ever expect. I had cleaned his wound. My duty, if any existed, was done. To stay was madness. To be caught here was social death, maybe real death. I stood up, brushing the sand from my skirt. I walked over and picked up the rifle. Its familiar, cold weight was a comfort. I stood at the entrance, the last of the daylight warm on my skin. I could just make out the path I'd taken, leading back to my empty life, to the silence, to the safety of four walls and a locked door. I thought of the whisperers at the trading post, their eager, fearful faces. I thought of the cavalry, who saw everything in terms of problems to be solved with a gun or a rope. I thought of my husband, a good man who believed in law and order and fences. And then I looked back into the cave, at the wounded man silhouetted against the small, defiant fire. He was not a ghost. He was a man who chose to die free. He was the last true thing in a country that was being tamed and sold and stripped of its wild soul. I didn't make a grand decision. I just found I couldn't take that first step back into the light. My feet were rooted to the stone. From deep in the canyon, a sound carried on the still evening air, not a bird, not the wind. It was the distinct, metallic jingle of a bit and bridle. The sound froze us both solid. It was a single, clear note of metal on metal, a noise that didn't belong to the canyon. In the cave, the fire suddenly seemed like a beacon, a foolish flag waving to announce our presence. He moved first, a quick, pained lunge that scattered the small circle of stones with his foot, smothering the young flames in a hiss of dirt and smoke. Darkness slammed back into the space, thick and complete. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. His hand found my arm in the blackness, his grip urgent. "Down," he breathed, the word a puff of air against my ear. He pulled me gently but firmly to the cold floor, behind the bulk of a fallen rock near the cave's rear wall. I went without protest, the rifle held awkwardly across my lap. We crouched there, two shadows in a pool of deeper shadow. I could feel the heat of him beside me, could hear the careful, controlled rhythm of his breathing as he listened. My own heart was a wild drum, so loud I was sure it would echo out the entrance and give us away. The jingle came again, closer this time, followed by the soft, hollow thump of a hoof on packed earth. Not one horse, several. They were moving slow, cautious, picking their way along the canyon floor. A man's voice drifted in, the words indistinct but the tone casual, conversational. Another voice answered, closer to the cave mouth. I stopped breathing. A slice of twilight sky was visible through the entrance, a narrow ribbon of deepening blue. A shadow passed across it, the shape of a man on a horse. The silhouette paused, seeming to look right into the mouth of our hiding place. I pressed myself against the cold stone, praying my pale dress wasn't a glaring patch of light in the dark. The Apache beside me had gone perfectly still, not a muscle moving. He was part of the rock itself. "Ain't nothing down this crack, Sam," a voice called out, so near it made me jump. "Just a dead end in a pile of scrub." "Check it anyway," came the reply, the voice of authority. Lieutenant said, thorough. "He don't like loose ends." Boots crunched on gravel, approaching the entrance. A figure filled the opening, a tall man with a cavalry-issue hat silhouetted against the sky. He took a step inside, and I could see the glint of a rifle barrel in his hands. He peered into the gloom, his eyes sweeping past our hiding spot. He took another step, his boots scuffing the sand where our fire had been just moments before. He paused, and I saw his head tilt. He was looking at the disturbed ground, at the scattered, still warm stones. My fingers dug into the stock of my own rifle. The man beside me didn't stir, but I felt the coiled readiness in him, a spring about to snap. The soldier knelt, touching the stones. He was going to know, he was going to call out. From outside, a loud curse echoed through the canyon. Blast it all. This nags picked up a stone. The soldier in the entrance straightened up, turning his head toward the commotion. The moment stretched, thin and tight as a wire. Then, with a grunt of annoyance, he turned and walked back out into the open. "Coming," he yelled. "This hole's just a raccoon den. Let's get back to the main trail before we lose all the light." The sounds of the horses moved away, the jingling and the low talk fading gradually until there was only the familiar whisper of the canyon wind. Still, we did not move. We waited until the last purple blush of light was gone from the entrance and the cave was a pocket of true night. Only then did he let out a long, slow breath, a sound of released tension. "They will camp for the night," he said, his voice low and sure. "They will not find this place again in the dark. But at first light, they will come back. They know this canyon is a good place to hide." I realized I was shaking, a fine tremble that started deep in my bones. The close call had left me cold. "You saved me from being found," I whispered. It was a strange thing to say to the man they were hunting. He was silent for a moment. "You lit a fire for an enemy. You bound a wound." That was a foolish thing. "It was a human thing," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. In the dark, I heard a soft, almost inaudible sound. It might have been a sigh. "Human things are often the most foolish," he said. He shifted, and I heard the rustle of his clothing, the faint, pained intake of breath. The bandage I'd put on was a temporary fix at best. He needed proper care, and he needed to be gone from here. "You can't travel with that wound," I said, the practical problem pushing aside the fear. "Not with them out there? You'll leave a trail a child could follow?" "I have left no trail for many years," he said, a hint of that old, grim pride in his voice. But it was followed by a weariness that undermined it. "This changes things. The body betrays the spirit." An idea was forming in my mind, a dangerous, impossible idea. It was the kind of idea that could see me run off my land or worse. But the image of those silhouetted soldiers, so casual in their search, so ready to flush out a loose end, wouldn't leave me. They weren't hunting a phantom. They were hunting this weary, wounded man who had told me where to find my Mare. "My place," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "It's a half-hour's walk, east through the draw. It's just a claim shack. No one comes there, not since—" I trailed off. "You could rest there, for a night? Get your strength." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the drip of distant water on stone. When he spoke, his voice held no gratitude, only a deep suspicion. "Why would you do this?" I didn't have a good answer, not one that made sense. It wasn't charity. It wasn't love for his people, whom I only knew from frightening tales. It was something else, something that had been growing in the hollow space my husband's death left behind. It was a rebellion against the loneliness, against the whispering neighbors, against the entire, ordered world that had left me on the fringe to wither. Helping him was a secret. It was something that belonged entirely to me, a choice no one else could make. "Because they're looking for a ghost in the hills," I said finally. "They won't look for a man in a widow's shack," he considered this. The risk was monstrous for both of us. If he was found under my roof, my life as I knew it was over. If I betrayed him, his life was over. We were strangers, bound only by an hour of shared fear and a flicker of firelight. "The soldiers," he said, "they will come to your house. They ask questions of everyone when they are on a hunt." "Let them come," I said, a strange steel in my voice I didn't recognize. "I am a grieving widow. They will see a lonely woman who is scared of noises in the night. They will not look twice at my root cellar or the old hayloft in the lean-to." Another long pause, then a simple statement. "It is a long walk." It was his way of agreeing. The relief that washed over me was immediate, followed by a fresh wave of terror at what I had just set in motion. We waited another hour, until the moon rose, a slim crescent that offered little light but enough to see the shapes of the rocks. He moved stiffly, favoring his injured side. I led the way, moving as quietly as I could through the familiar draw, my ears straining for any sound of the patrol. He was a shadow behind me, silent as the stories promised. When the dark shape of my shack appeared against the starry sky, a little knot of homey smoke rising from the chimney I'd left banked, it looked different. It wasn't just my refuge anymore. It was a hiding place. It was a secret. I turned to him before we crossed the last open patch of yard. In the faint moonlight, his face was all sharp angles and deep pools of shadow. "What do I call you?" I asked. I couldn't keep thinking of him as the Apache or the ghost. He was a man in my care now. He looked at my humble home, then back at me. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes besides pain and wariness. It was a flicker of something like curiosity. "They called me a ghost," he said softly. "You gave me water and cloth. You should choose the name." He moved past me then, a silent outline slipping toward the darker shadow of the lean-to barn. I stood alone in the cool night, holding my rifle, the weight of what I had done settling on my shoulders like a heavy, unfamiliar coat. Inside the shack, the fire was low. Outside, the vast hills slept under the cold stars. And somewhere in the space between, a man I did not know trusted me with his life. The soldiers would come with the sun. I would have to look them in the eye and lie. The quiet of the night was no longer empty. It was thick with waiting, and the next move was not mine to make. It belonged to the dawn and to the men who hunted what they could not see. The next 2 days were a lesson in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the empty silence of before. It was a listening silence, a watchful one, stretched thin over every ordinary chore. I went about my business, feeding the chickens, drawing water, tending my sorry little vegetable patch. But my eyes were always on the horizon line where the trail from the post came over the rise. My ears were tuned to the sound of hoofbeats that weren't my bay marais. He stayed in the old lean-to, a space half filled with leftover hay and forgotten tools. I had made a pallet there, hidden behind a stack of weathered crates. I brought him food-simple stew, cornbread and fresh water and cloth for his wound. We spoke little. Sometimes I would find him standing at the small, high opening that looked west toward his hills, his posture straight despite the pain, his gaze fixed on something I could not see. He was a statue of patience, but I could feel the restlessness in him, the spirit chafing against the confines of four walls and a hiding place. I called him Kaya. It was a word I'd heard once, from a trapper who'd been friendly with the people east of here. He'd said it meant one who stays, who remains. It seemed to fit. He never confirmed it, but he answered to it with a slow turn of his head, an acknowledgement. On the morning of the third day, they came. I was at the well, the bucket in my hand, when I saw the dust plume. A tight fist closed around my heart. I lowered the bucket slowly, smoothed my apron, and walked back to the shack to wait on the porch, as any woman alone might do. There were 4 of them, cavalry, their blue coats bright and official against the dun-colored land. The lieutenant was a young man with a clean-shaven face and eyes that missed nothing. He tipped his hat, polite but distant. "Ma'am," he said, "apologies for the intrusion. We're on patrol, following up on reports of renegade activity in these hills." I kept my hands folded in my apron, hoping he couldn't see the tremor in them. "Renegade activity?" I asked, letting my voice lift with a fear that was not entirely pretended. "An Apache," the lieutenant said, watching my face closely. "One of the last holdouts from the old band. He's been causing trouble. Stole some supplies from a mining camp, spooked some cattle. A dangerous man." He said it with a certainty that brooked no argument. I made myself look at him, my eyes wide. "I heard stories." "At the post." "They said he was a ghost." The lieutenant's mouth tightened. "He's flesh and blood, ma'am, and he's wounded. We had a skirmish with him 3 days back in the high canyons. He took a knife blade, we believe. He can't have gone far." He paused, his gaze sweeping over my modest homestead. "Have you seen anything? Any sign? A missing chicken? Tools out of place? Has anything felt off?" My mind raced. A missing chicken would be too obvious, a trail straight to my door. But to say everything was perfectly normal seemed wrong, too. A lonely woman would be nervous. I thought I heard a noise 2 nights back," I said, my voice dropping to a confessional whisper. "Out by the barn." It spooked the Mara. I took my husband's rifle and looked, but it was just dark. "Probably a coyote." I let my eyes dart toward the lean-to, then back to my hands, a nervous gesture. This country plays tricks on a person alone. The lieutenant followed my glance. The lean-to door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. Mind if we have a look around, ma'am? For your safety as much as anything. It was not a request. My mouth went dry. Of course, I said, the words ash in my mouth. I stood on the porch, my back rigid, as two of the soldiers poked around the yard, looking under the porch, checking the small root cellar. The lieutenant and a sergeant walked toward the lean-to. I could see the shape of the sergeant's hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The lieutenant pushed the creaking door open wider, and they stepped inside. Time stopped. I could hear the low murmur of their voices, the shuffle of their boots in the dry hay. I imagined Kaya, pressed into the deepest shadow behind the crates, not breathing, a hand over the old skinning knife I'd left for him, its blade dull but sharp enough. I saw my whole future hanging in the dust-moted air of that shed, ruin, shame, perhaps a cell for aiding a renegade, then a sharp curse from the sergeant. "Blasted nail!" he grumbled, stumbling back out into the light, shaking his hand. Tore my sleeve clean on a splintered crate in there. "Place is a death trap, ma'am." The lieutenant emerged a moment later, brushing a cobweb from his uniform sleeve. He looked frustrated, his clean-shaven face pinched. He gave the yard one more sweeping look, his eyes passing over the peaceful chickens, the quiet well, the lonely figure of a widow on her porch. "Thank you for your cooperation, ma'am," he said, his tone formal again. "If you see or hear anything, you send word to the post immediately. This isn't a ghost story. This is a dangerous man." I nodded, unable to speak. They mounted up and turned their horses back toward the trail. I stood there, watching until they were specks in the distance, until the dust settled back onto the hard earth. Only then did my legs give way. I sank onto the porch step, my whole body trembling with the aftermath of fear. A shadow fell across me. He stood in the doorway of the shack, having slipped inside from the lean-to's rear while the soldiers were distracted. He had heard everything. His face was like carved wood, but his eyes held a storm. "They think I stole," he said, his voice low and hard. "They think I spooked cattle. They need a reason," I said weakly. "To make the hunt make sense to others." He shook his head once, a sharp, angry motion. "The reason is that I am here." "And I'm not supposed to be?" "That is the only reason they have ever needed." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flash of something like shame beneath the pride. "You lied for me." "You put your life next to mine. For a thief and a ghost." "You're not a thief," I said, finding my voice again. "And you're sure not a ghost." He was silent for a long time, looking out to where the soldiers had vanished. "The wound is better," he said finally. "2 more days, then I go." The words should have been a relief. They were the sensible thing, the safe thing, but they landed in my chest with a dull, heavy weight. His going would return me to the old silence, the one that now seemed even emptier. It would also mean his almost certain death. The soldiers were not giving up. They had a pattern now, a tighter net. At evening, a new tension hung between us. It was no longer just the tension of hidden and hider. It was the tension of a path forking ahead, and neither branch looked clear. I sat mending by the firelight. He stood at the window, watching the night. "The mining camp they spoke of," he said, not turning around. "It is in the sacred valley, the place of the spring. They blast the rock there, they poison the water. The cattle they say I spooked were trampling the burial grounds." I turned them away. I put my mending down. He had not spoken of his people, of his reasons until now. He spoke not with anger, but with a profound, weary sorrow. He was not causing trouble. He was trying to hold back a tide that was washing away everything he knew. And they had painted him a monster for it. "They won't understand that," I said softly. "I do not need them to understand," he replied. "I only need them to stop." The next day the air changed. It was in the wind, a sharper bite. The clouds gathered, low and bruised-looking, over the hills. A storm was coming, the first real one of the season. By afternoon the first fat, cold drops began to fall, splattering the dusty ground. It was a blessing and a curse. It would hide trails. It would also keep people indoors, wondering. And then, just as the gray light began to fail, I saw a single rider coming hard from the direction of the post. It wasn't a soldier. It was the man who ran the trading post himself, his slicker gleaming with rain. My stomach turned to ice. This was not a patrol. This was something else. He reined up in my yard, his horse blowing steam. His face was grim under the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "There's news. They found something. Up in the high canyon where they first tracked him. A campsite, hidden, more recent than they thought. They're saying he's got help? That someone in the settlements is hiding him." The rain dripped from the roof, a steady, dreadful drumbeat. I forced my face into a mask of confusion and fear. Who would do such a thing? The storekeeper leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Some are saying it might be a sympathizer. Someone alone on the edge of things. Someone who might relate." His eyes were on me, not unkindly, but with a piercing curiosity. "They're organizing a proper search party at first light, storm or no storm. Going to check every homestead, every cabin, every inch. The lieutenant's got a bloodhound coming up from the fort." He straightened up. "I thought you ought to know. Being out here alone. Lock your doors tonight." He turned his horse and rode back into the curtain of rain, leaving me standing there, soaked and frozen to my core. A bloodhound, a search of every building. They had moved from suspicion to certainty? Someone had talked, or they had found a thread, a forgotten footprint, a witness I didn't know about, and were pulling it straight to my door. I turned and went inside. Kaya was already there, having heard the conversation from the back room. Water dripped from my hair onto the rough floorboards. We looked at each other across the small, warm space of the cabin. The fire popped and hissed. "They know," I said, the words final. "They suspect," he corrected, but his eyes said he knew the truth. The fragile shelter we had built was crumbling. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one about to break upon us. "You have to go, tonight, now, the rain will cover you." He didn't argue. He nodded, his face set. He moved to gather the few things he had, the knife, the water pouch I'd given him. He was still weak, but the desperate light in his eyes was stronger than any wound. "Where will you go?" I asked, my heart a frantic bird in a cage. He looked toward the west, toward his hills. "There is a place, beyond the high ridge, a canyon within a canyon. If I can reach it," he didn't finish. "If he could reach it, he might live. But the journey would be brutal, and the soldiers with their dog would be between him and that sanctuary by morning." It was a terrible gamble. As he fastened the slicker I handed him, his hands brushed mine. He stopped, his dark eyes holding mine. In them I saw not just the warrior, not just the hunted man, but the person who had shared my fire, who had trusted my bandage, who had listened to my fears in the dark. "You have given me more than shelter," he said, his voice rough. "You have given me a reminder." "Of what?" "That not all hearts in this country are fenced." Then he was at the door. The wind whipped it open, spraying rain inside. He was a silhouette against the stormy twilight. One last look, a nod that held a world of unspoken words, and he stepped out into the sheeting rain, swallowed by the gray gloom in moments. I stood in the empty doorway, the cold air washing over me. He was gone. The shack was silent again, but the silence was screaming I had done it. I had sent him into the storm and the teeth of the hunt. I was safe. The soldiers would find nothing here tomorrow but a frightened widow. But as I closed the door and turned to face the lonely fire, I knew I could not stay. The thought of sitting here, waiting for them with their questions and their knowing looks, listening for a shot in the distant hills, it was impossible. He was out there, wounded, with a bloodhound and a cavalry patrol between him and safety. And I was the only one who knew the path he would have to take, the only one who knew where the hidden canyon within a canyon might be. I looked at my husband's rifle, leaning by the door. I looked at the warm, dry room. Then I walked to the peg and took down my own worn coat. I picked up the rifle. I blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the fire's embers. I opened the door once more, facing the lashing rain and the wild black night. I had made my choice. I was not staying behind to wait. The ghost in the hills was flesh and blood, and I was going after him. The rain was a blindfold and a whip. It drove into my face, cold and stinging, soaking through my coat and dress within moments. The world was reduced to sound and feeling, the roar of the downpour, the squelch of mud under my boots, the slick grasp of wet rock under my hands as I climbed out of the draw behind my shack. I carried the rifle, but it felt like a useless weight, a symbol of a life I was leaving behind. I was not a hunter. I was a woman following a thread of hope into a storm. I knew these foothills like the lines on my own palm, even in the dark. I headed west, toward the high ridge he'd spoken of, moving as fast as I dared on the slippery ground. The wind screamed through the pines, masking any sound I made, but also masking any sound of him ahead, or of danger behind. My mind was a single, focused point: find him before the soldiers did. He was wounded, and the storm, while it hid his trail, would also sap his strength. He would not make it to the hidden canyon by morning. Hours bled together in the dark and wet. My skirts became heavy with mud, dragging at my legs. I stumbled over unseen roots, catching myself on tree trunks, my breath rasping in my chest. Just as doubt began to creep in, a cold, sharp-toothed voice telling me I was a fool lost in the wilderness, I saw it. A faint, ragged scrap of dark cloth, caught on a thorny brush at the mouth of a narrow gully. It was from the slicker I'd given him. He had come this way. The gully was a steep, rocky scar leading up toward the ridge. The rain had turned it into a shallow, rushing creek. I started up, using my hands to claw my way over the slick stones. The sound of the water covered my gasps. Near the top, where the gully opened onto a windswept ledge, I saw him. He was on his knees, one hand braced against the rock face, head bowed against the ring. He was spent. The climb and the cold and the wound had taken everything he had left. He didn't hear me approach over the storm. I knelt beside him, my hand on his arm. He flinched, then looked up. In the murky pre-dawn light, his face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes widened in disbelief. "You," he breathed, the word lost in the wind. "You should not be here." "Neither should you," I said, my voice trembling with cold and effort. "Not like this. You won't make the ridge." He knew it was true. The defiant set of his shoulders sagged. "Then this is a good place," he said, looking out at the wild, rain-lashed valley below. "A good place to see the sun one last time." A raw anger surged in me, hotter than any fire. "No," I said, the force of the word surprising us both. "You don't get to just stop, not after all this." I looked around frantically. The ledge offered no shelter, no hiding place. Below us, the gully was a trap. Then I saw it not a cave, but a deep undercut in the cliff face, hidden by a thick curtain of hanging roots and sodden moss. It was just a shallow scoop in the rock, but it was out of the direct lash of the rain. "There," I said, pulling at his arm. "Come on." Somehow, we stumbled the few yards to the overhang. It was just deep enough for us to huddle inside, a damp, dark pocket smelling of wet earth and ancient stone. We collapsed against the back wall, side by side, water streaming from our clothes. The wind howled past the entrance, but we were, for the moment, shielded. The gray light of a stormy dawn began to seep into the world, revealing the misery and determination on both our faces. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm slowly begin to ease. The drumming rain softened to a patter, then a drip. A pale, watery light filtered through the moss. "Why did you come?" he asked finally, his voice a low rumble in the confined space. I thought of the empty shack, the whispering neighbors, the long, silent years that had stretched ahead of me before he stumbled into my life. "Because I was tired of being a ghost too," I said softly. "Just a different kind. The kind that haunts an empty house." He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the warrior's guard fall completely. I saw the man beneath the one who loved his hills, who grieved for his people, who was so terribly tired of running. "Kaya," he said, using the name I had given him. "It is a good name. It means my elder sister, a protector." Tears, hot and sudden, mixed with the rain on my cheeks. I had not known. The sound we heard next was not the storm. It was a distant, mournful baying, carried on the clean, wet air. The bloodhound. They had started their search at first light, just as the storekeeper said they would. The sound was coming from the direction of my homestead. They were on his trail, and it would lead them straight up the gully to this ledge. His hand found mine in the dim light. His grip was firm, warm. There were no more words. We had run out of time and places to hide. We would be found here, together. The story would write itself. The deranged widow and the savage, a tragic, scandalous end. I felt a strange calm settle over me. At least I would not be alone. We listened as the baying grew clearer, closer. We could hear men's voices now, shouts of encouragement to the dog. They were in the gully, climbing. I picked up the rifle from where it lay beside me. I did not know what I would do with it, but I would not let them take us without some final, futile act of defiance. He placed his hand over mine on the stock, not to stop me, but to share in the gesture. The dog's bark was suddenly frantic, excited. It had reached the ledge. We could hear its paws scrabbling on the wet rock, just beyond our curtain of roots and moss. A man's voice, the lieutenant's, sharp and clear. "Here, the trail leads here. Spread out." This was it. I took a deep, shuddering breath, ready to face them. And then the world intervened. From high above the ridge, a new sound erupted, a deep, grinding rumble that was felt in the bones more than heard. The storm had saturated the ancient, fractured rock of the high slopes. With a sound like thunder rolling underground, a part of the mountainside let go. It was not a vast landslide, but it was enough. We heard the soldiers' shouts turn to cries of alarm. The dog's barking cut off in a yelp. There was a tremendous crash of rock and mud and snapping trees from the gully below the ledge, a roar that went on for a full minute before subsiding into an eerie, dripping quiet. Dust, fine as flour, filtered through our mossy curtain. We sat frozen, holding our breaths. No more shouts, no baying. Only the drip of water and the sigh of the wind. Cautiously, he moved to the edge of our shelter and peered out. After a moment, he gestured for me to look. The gully we had climbed was gone. In its place was a fresh, raw scar of mud, boulders, and broken timber. The slide had cut directly across the path, burying it under tons of earth and rock. There was no sign of the soldiers or their dog. They were either buried or, more likely, they had been on the lower part of the trail and had retreated from the slide, their path completely blocked. The ridge above us, however, was untouched. The way to the hidden canyons beyond was clear. We looked at each other. The impossible had happened. The mountain itself had shaken loose and bought us our freedom. The hunt, for now, was over. The trail was buried, and with it any proof that led to me. He helped me to my feet. We stepped out onto the ledge. The air was fresh and clean, washed by the storm. A weak, golden beam of sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, illuminating the valley below, making the wet pines shine like emeralds. "The canyon within a canyon?" I said. "Is it far?" "A day's walk," he said. "For a strong walker." He looked at me, his eyes asking the question he would not voice. I looked back the way we had come, toward the world of shacks and posts and whispers. Then I looked west, toward the hidden places, toward a future that was utterly unknown. The choice was no choice at all. I adjusted the strap of the rifle on my shoulder. I met his gaze. "Then we should get started," I said. "Before the light changes." A slow, true smile touched his eyes, the first I had ever seen. It transformed his weary face. He nodded, a deep respect in the gesture. He did not offer me his hand, for we were beyond that now. He simply turned and began to walk, sure-footed, along the ledge that led upward to the high ridge. I followed. The sun grew stronger, warming our backs. Below us, the world we had known was already receding, reshaped by rain and rockfall. Ahead, the vast, silent, beautiful wilderness stretched out, holding its secrets close. We were two ghosts who had found solid ground, two lonely hearts who had forged a bond in the dark. We walked, not as hunter and hunted, not as widow and warrior, but simply as two people, leaving one story behind and stepping together into the next. The hills watched us go, and they did not whisper. They simply were, and now, at last, so were we.